friend of mine was facing some real challenges. And so I said to him, almost in passing, I will remember you prayerfully, both you and your circumstances. And he said to me, don't pray for me, do something. Before we knew that COVID was a pandemic, we as a church community had begun to pray the Lord's Prayer each Sunday, not as some attachment or addition to the end of another prayer, as is sometimes our practice in the Methodist Church, but we made it the main prayer of our day. We tried to pray it slowly, and as I said, we did it every Sunday. And then the pandemic arrived and lockdown happened, and I tried to keep this prayer before us as a community as best I could, but I've not been as successful as I had hoped to be. So I thought it would be good for a few of these midweek devotions for us to live a little in the Lord's Prayer again as a community. And today we begin with the most familiar of those words, the opening phrase, Our Father in heaven. Our Father in heaven. And before we can go on, before we can pray any further, we have to pause on that word Father. We can't ignore it, because it is both beautiful and complicated. In different lives, it has different meanings. When Jesus uses the word Father, we can be fairly confident of the fact that his purpose wasn't to say that God was male. This wasn't a gender statement by Jesus when he taught us to pray this prayer. He was wanting to help us, and you can understand in his day, he's wanting to help us understand something about God's character, about God's nature. And it is very important how we think of God, because what we think of God will make its way into how we live. And thinking of God as being singularly male will affect how we view both God and our world. So history is littered with stories of nations who have climbed on the back of a testosterone-filled God of their own making and gone to war and murdered and pillaged and raped and destroyed in God's name. And even in this year, 2020, in our advanced stages of development, we assume, there are still men in the Christian community who believe that God is male, and that therefore that affords them the right to treat women badly. God's supposed maleness, they think, has left men with the right to be superior and to think of women as inferior creations. Someone once said, if God is male, then the male is God. And I remember with real sadness now, and this really did happen many years ago, but I remember still with sadness, a man who brought his wife to see me in my office so that I could explain to her that it was his God-given right to beat her, to discipline her. It's very important how we think of God. So all we need to really do is look at humanity, and we affirm with ease that all of us are created in the image of God. And so in our glorious diversity, it surely becomes impossible for us to think that God is somewhat monochromatic, somewhat singular in his nature. He cannot just be this one limited thing. It's impossible for me to think that God could be defined as male. And even that prefacing word to this glorious prayer, Our Father, is a key clue to our thinking. He is not just my God, he is the God of all humanity, and his life and his character are reflected in the diversity we see in humanity and in all of creation. Now, this is not new thinking. I think for some people it will feel new, for some it might even feel a little unsettling. But in fact, over all the centuries, the church has in one way or another recognized that God cannot be defined by a single gender. One of the most famous people who spoke in this way to help us in years gone by was Julian of Norwich. She lived in the 14th century. And she said, just as God is our Father, so God is also our mother. She also happened to have a fond penchant for describing Jesus as our precious mother. Now, at its heart, prayer is fundamentally about trust. When we come to pray, we come to put our trust in someone or something. So I want to ask today that as we begin to pray this prayer that Jesus taught us, that what we are invited to do in these words that Jesus has given us is that we open ourselves to the fullness, the diversity of God's character, the completeness of who He is. That God is not simply this gender identity, but that what Jesus intended was to help us see that God is faithful and God is steadfast and God is just and God is slow to anger and God is full of compassion and God is loving, and the list goes on, but they are all summed up in this one singular exquisite word. The shorthand that Jesus gives us is the phrase, our Father. On Ascension Day, I spoke a little bit about the nearness of heaven, so I don't want to get into it in too much detail again today, but allow me to remind us once more that when we say our Father in heaven, it's not a way of saying that our Father who lives far away. It's in fact quite the opposite. To speak about our Father in heaven is to affirm that where God is, there is heaven. The whole purpose of Jesus' ministry was to tell us that in Him God had drawn near. So heaven is always a conversation about the nearness of God. Elizabeth Barrett Browning has those wonderful words, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God." So heaven describes God's intimate and imminent nearness to His people. So if we wanted to, we could take that opening sentence that Jesus gives us and we could stretch it out, if you like, and we could say something, and this is incomplete obviously, but we could say something: you are our deeply loving, compassionate, righteous, gentle and just God who is always near us. But I just think that Jesus' phrase is just so much better, and it's those two words, our Father. And here for me is the magnificent thing about this opening part of the prayer. In many ways, those two simple words are probably almost everything we would ever need to say. They fit in every circumstance of life. They describe perhaps everything humanity would need to say to God. Think about it with me for a moment. When life is terrible, we muster the strength and turn to God and say, our Father. When life is glad, we cry with praise, our Father. When we are in need, we turn to Him and we go, our Father. When we are anxious for others, and especially for those we love, we say, our Father. And when the world looks like it's going to hell in a handbasket, we turn to God and we look a little further and we say, our Father. So my friend may well be right. There probably is much more to do in this life than pray, and I think we'll discover that in the weeks ahead. But let me say of this, I feel sure that these words, our Father, are a pretty good place to start. Thanks for joining us today. God bless you.